It was the sort of snow that made everything look innocent, the sort that turned hedgerows into lace and muffled the sound of passing cars. In the village of Chippingdean, that kind of snow came only once a year, if it came at all. But this year it had arrived early, coating the thatched roofs and narrow lanes in deceptive tranquillity. Miss Marple had been visiting her niece Judith for Christmas, a tradition they upheld when the calendar allowed. Judith's husband, a quiet man named Edward Locke, owned the old rectory at the end of the village. It was a pleasant, if somewhat draughty house, filled with odd antique clocks and books on farming methods he never applied. Miss Marple found it charming, though she often suspected Edward found her presence a disruption to the quiet life he preferred. On the morning of December 23rd, the village awoke to a gruesome discovery: a man dead in the sitting room of Orchard Cottage. The man was Mr. Edgar Blaine, an irritable bachelor known for his lawsuits over garden fences and barking dogs. He was found slumped in his armchair, still dressed in his evening suit, the fireplace flickering low beside him. At first the doctor assumed it was natural causes, heart failure perhaps, but a closer look revealed a dark line on his neck, just below the collar. He had been strangled, with a thin wire no doubt, and from behind. The local constable, a nervous young man with too much to prove, declared the house locked from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no footprints in the snow outside the sitting room window. It was, in the words of the overzealous newspaper that arrived the next morning, an impossible crime. Yet it was the discovery on the writing desk that made it infamous. A Christmas card, addressed to Miss Clara Temple, had been signed, with warmest wishes, Edgar Blaine, and beneath it, in unmistakable ink, sent posthumously with apologies. Macabre joke, muttered the constable, but Miss Marple had only leaned in closer. People do not often sign their own death, she said quietly, unless, of course, they did not. Miss Marple hadn't known Edgar Blaine well, though she'd seen him at village fetes and the occasional parish meeting. He was not, by all accounts, a likeable man. He had filed 3 lawsuits in as many months, shouted at choir boys during rehearsal, and once threatened to shoot a neighbour's cat for walking along his garden wall. But strangling him in his own home, in a locked room, and then writing a cryptic Christmas card. The inspector from the county arrived the next day. Inspector Drew, a man with a large moustache and a permanently unimpressed expression, began his interviews promptly, starting with Clara Temple. She was a widow, living 2 cottages down from Edgar's house, and she had once been engaged to him many years ago. The engagement ended badly. "I never saw him," Clara said, twisting her gloves. "Not for years. Not since... Well, it doesn't matter. Why would he send me a card, and what does posthumously mean? It's absurd." "Did you receive any card?" "No," she said. "Only what you found there." Could he have been making amends? He didn't know the meaning of the word. Others were questioned. His housekeeper, who lived in the next village and came only twice a week. The vicar, who had recently argued with Edgar over church donations. Even a visiting chimney sweep who had seen Blaine 2 days before the murder. But no one seemed to know how the card got written, or how anyone could have entered the locked house. The only key was in Edgar's own pocket. The chimney was too narrow to allow entry, and the windows had frost on the inside, undisturbed. That evening, as Judith dozed by the fire, and Edward buried himself in his papers, Miss Marple took her knitting and sat quietly thinking. She thought about Edgar Blaine, his habits, his paranoia, the lawsuits, and she thought about Clara Temple, about a woman who had been publicly shamed decades ago, and who had aged into a quiet, dignified figure the village respected, if not pitied. The next morning Miss Marple visited Inspector Drew at the constabulary. "I believe," she said softly, "we may be approaching this from the wrong direction. You are searching for a killer who entered a locked house. But what if the killer never had to enter at all?" Drew raised an eyebrow. "Go on." Miss Marple smiled. "You said yourself the card was the most curious element of the scene, and I agree. If we ask not who could have killed Edgar, but why he would write such a message before he died, then it begins to look quite different. You think it was suicide?" "Oh, no," she said. "Mr. Blaine had too much ego for that. I believe he suspected something. I believe he arranged that card to be found. Only he didn't write it. He dictated it." "To whom?" Miss Marple hesitated. That is what I intend to find out. Back at Orchard Cottage, she asked permission to examine the desk again. The inspector allowed it, mildly amused. Miss Marple ran her fingers along the edge of the card, then the ink bottle, then the blotter. She studied the fireplace, the worn rug, the half-finished cup of tea on the side table. Then she asked a question no one had asked yet. Who delivered his post? It turned out the village boy had last picked up outgoing letters on the afternoon of the 22nd, but none were addressed to Clara Temple, and the card was not in the outgoing pile. So why had Edgar prepared it? Unless it wasn't meant to be sent at all. It was meant to be found. That evening, Miss Marple asked Judith if she might visit Clara again. Judith agreed, though she was clearly uneasy. You don't think Clara? I think she has carried a great sadness for many years, Miss Marple replied. And sometimes the heart does strange things when it is asked to carry both pain and silence for too long. Clara Temple answered the door herself. Her cottage was modest but neat, and her hands trembled as she poured the tea. I just have one question, Miss Marple said gently. Was it you who wrote the card? Clara Temple sat very still. For a long time she said nothing. Then she looked up. He called me that night. He said he thought someone meant to kill him. He wanted me to know he had changed his will, that he was sorry for what happened all those years ago. He asked me to come. Did you? I did. I still had a key from long ago. I let myself in, and I found him, already dead. But the card was there, unwritten, just a blank one with my name on the envelope, and the pen was in his hand. It was as though he'd been about to sign it. So, you did it for him. I wrote what he meant to say, she whispered. He'd asked me to forgive him, and I had. After all these years, I finally had. Did you see anyone else? She shook her head. Only the fire, nearly out, and the silence. Miss Marple touched her hand. You gave him what he never gave you, dignity. But it was still murder. She returned to the inspector and told him everything. Clara did not kill him, but the card, yes, that was her hand. So, who did? Miss Marple paused. Someone who had been in the house before the snow fell. Someone who had a reason to hate Edgar Blaine more than Clara ever did. And she remembered the chimney sweep, a quiet man, with scars on his hands and a past connection. His father had been ruined by one of Blaine's lawsuits, driven to suicide. He had not come to clean the chimney. He had come to kill. The sweep was arrested, and in time, he confessed. The locked room had not been locked at all. Edgar had let him in, expecting only argument. But instead came a length of wire and a quiet, practiced silence. The card had nothing to do with the crime, but in the end, it had solved it. Miss Marple returned to her niece's house just as the church bells began to ring for Christmas Eve. Snow was still falling, soft and white. She resumed her knitting beside the fire and smiled to herself. The village would forget the crime in time, but not the mystery, and not the card, signed by a dead man with one last message to deliver. The snowfall thickened as dusk settled over Chipping Dean, muffling even the chimes of the church bell in the village square. The rectory windows glowed faintly golden in the half-light, candles flickering behind frosted glass. Inside, the mood was solemn but still. Edward had withdrawn into his study, muttering about ledger errors and mislaid invoices, while Judith sat beside the fire with her embroidery untouched. Miss Marple, however, was not one to sit idle when a murder still left questions in its wake. Though Inspector Drew believed the matter settled, the chimney sweep in custody, the motive clear, the card explained. Miss Marple was not entirely at ease. Not because she doubted the confession, which she did not, but because something about it had rung too tidy, too well wrapped for such a messy affair. It wasn't until the next morning that a peculiar detail tugged again at her mind. While revisiting the evidence list Inspector Drew had allowed her to peruse, more out of indulgence than necessity, she noticed a line about a brass match holder recovered from the hearth at Orchard Cottage, an unremarkable item on its own. But Miss Marple remembered something curious. When she had visited the sitting room that first day, there had been no matches by the fire, and yet the embers had been freshly stirred. She requested a walk to the cottage once more, and though the inspector was now occupied preparing reports for the magistrate, He gave his half-hearted approval. "If you must, Miss Marple," he said, with the tone of a man convinced the case had already been gift-wrapped for the courts. A light snowfall dusted the cottage's stone threshold as she stepped carefully inside, led by Constable Ellis. It was his first winter in Chipping Dean, and he followed her like a child, hoping to impress a tutor. "We're not supposed to let visitors in," he said, but the inspector said if anyone was to be allowed— "Yes, yes," Miss Marple murmured. She was already peering into the fireplace where the brass match holder sat now, neatly beside the iron poker. "Has anyone touched these?" "Not since you were last here, I think. We tidied the scene a bit, cleared away the tea things, but everything else has been left." Miss Marple picked up the match holder. It was cold and polished, unusually so. Not a speck of ash on it. Too clean. Someone had scrubbed it. She set it down slowly. "Constable, do you recall if Mr. Blaine smoked?" "Pipes," he said immediately. "Always had a short clay pipe in the evening." "Yet not a trace of one on the table or hearth. Curious, isn't it?" Maybe it was in his pocket. But it hadn't been. It had been listed in the evidence. Keys, a coin purse, handkerchief, will, no pipe. Miss Marple turned toward the writing desk again, then to the settee. "And what of the cushion?" "That one there, the needlepoint with the roses." "Ma'am?" She reached down and lifted it gently. There was an indentation underneath it, faint but present, a slight flattening on the fabric as if something had rested there, something narrow and metallic. She looked up at Constable Ellis, her brow slightly furrowed. "Tell me, have they found the murder weapon?" "They think it was piano wire, likely discarded somewhere outside, but with the snow—" "Yes, convenient snow, isn't it?" Her voice had gone quieter, and Ellis leaned in unconsciously. "You see, Constable, something troubles me. The sweep's confession. He claimed to have entered, killed Mr. Blaine in a fit of rage, and left before. The snow began falling in earnest, yet the fire was recently stirred, the ashes barely cold, and the match holder wiped." She moved again to the writing desk, running her finger along its edge. Then she opened the drawer slowly. Inside, amid envelopes and pens, she found what she wasn't expecting. A second ink bottle. This one dried at the neck. The one on the desk during the initial investigation had been fresh, uncapped, and clearly used for the Christmas card. "Why bring a second bottle unless the first had run dry?" she murmured. "Or unless someone wanted to swap it." "What would that matter?" Ellis asked, genuinely puzzled. But Miss Marple did not answer. Her mind was drawing connections quickly now. The fresh ink, the clean match holder, the missing pipe, the odd indentation under the cushion, and, most importantly, the one thing Clara Temple hadn't said, but had implied. "She said the fire was nearly out," Miss Marple murmured. "But when we arrived it had been stirred, newly fed, the embers red." "Perhaps she did it," Ellis offered. "Number—" "That's just it. Clara is a woman of emotional clarity even when grieving. She would not tidy a crime scene. And Edgar Blaine was not the sort to prepare a cosy fire if he suspected a murderer was coming." She turned now, quite suddenly. "Constable, was anyone else permitted into the house in those hours between the body's discovery and the inspector's arrival?" Ellis scratched his head. "Just the doctor, Dr. Hayward." A pause. "Of course," she said quietly. "Of course." That night Miss Marple returned home with an odd expression, a softness around the mouth, but something sharp in her eyes. Judith noticed it first. "You've thought of something." "I've noticed something," Miss Marple corrected. "And if I'm right, it's quite a terrible little thing." She said nothing more until morning, when she requested a meeting with Inspector Drew and Dr. Hayward at the constabulary. Drew was annoyed, but curious. Hayward, calm as ever, his spectacles low on the bridge of his nose, coat buttoned neatly. Miss Marple sat across from them, hands folded on her handbag. "I've only a few questions, for clarity's sake." "Very well," said Drew. "To Dr. Hayward, then. When you first examined Mr. Blaine's body, what time did you record death?" Hayward blinked. "I estimated sometime between 8 and 10 p.m. on the 22nd. It was difficult to be precise. The room was cold." "Ah, yes, cold," Miss Marple said lightly. "Yet the fire was warm when we arrived, very nearly fresh. Did you stir it, Doctor?" "I? Why would I?" "You were the first to arrive." Perhaps to look for signs of struggle or to see if anything had been tampered with. No, Miss Marple, that would be improper. She smiled gently. But you are a careful man. I know this. And when careful men commit murder, they clean up after themselves, wipe down match holders, replace ink bottles, even hide pipes. There was silence. Drew straightened. Miss Marple, are you... She's accusing me, Hayward said sharply, over a fireplace and a cushion. No, said Miss Marple. I'm accusing you because Edgar Blaine had changed his will. You signed as witness, and you stood to lose what he had once promised you. His estate, in fact. Impossible. He told Clara, she said softly. And the new will was in his pocket, unsigned. But the old one, the one where you were beneficiary, that one sat in your desk drawer, didn't it? Alongside the duplicate ink you used to forge his signature after he was dead. Hayward paled. You arrived before the constable. You had time. You strangled him. Perhaps not in passion, but in premeditation. You made it appear tidy. Even let Clara arrive, thinking it would help muddy the waters. Inspector Drew looked at Ellis, who had just stepped in at the door. Bring in the will. Compare the inks. If she's right. Miss Marple stood. I usually am. Eventually. She left them in that small, breathless room. Snowflakes drifted down again outside, soft and slow. In Chipping Dean, peace would return, but not without one more secret, uncovered by a woman with a needlepoint mind and eyes sharper than any inspector's. The snow had stopped by the following morning, leaving behind a crystalline hush that blanketed Chipping Dean in deceptive serenity. But inside the village constabulary, the air was tense. Inspector Drew's team had located the forged will and confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions. Dr. Hayward had been arrested quietly without protest. He'd simply removed his spectacles, folded them into their case and said, I suppose that's that. Yet something about the matter felt unfinished to Miss Marple. Too clean, she said quietly over tea with Judith. Too direct. Dr. Hayward is a careful man, yes, but not bold. He may have altered a document, but I do not think he killed Edgar Blaine. Not alone. Judith looked alarmed. But he confessed. Miss Marple gave a soft shake of her head. He confessed to the forgery, but not to the murder. He was protecting someone, or being protected. Later that afternoon, Inspector Drew invited Miss Marple to sit in on the next round of witness interviews. Not officially, of course. He couldn't very well admit to needing her. But he gestured to the spare chair with the briefest of nods and said, If you have any thoughts, you know where to find me. The first to be questioned again was Clara Temple. She entered with her coat pulled tightly around her, chin slightly raised. She sat with quiet dignity, her hands folded on her lap. I've told you all I know, she said. I went to the house because Edgar asked me to come. He said he feared something was about to happen, but I never imagined. Inspector. Drew leaned forward. Did he say who he feared? Clara hesitated. He mentioned someone, but vaguely. He said they wouldn't let him change things. I assumed he meant his solicitor or family, someone contesting the will. And you found the card already waiting? Yes. He'd written the address, just not the message. Miss Marple studied her carefully. There was sorrow in Clara's voice, but also restraint, a kind of calculated calm. When she left, Drew muttered, She's either telling the truth, or she's a better actress than most. Grief dulls some, sharpens others, Miss Marple replied. But I don't believe she's lying. Not about the visit. Next was Edwin Sharp, the groundskeeper who'd worked for Blaine on and off for years. A wiry, suspicious man with nicotine-stained fingers and a habit of darting his eyes. I didn't see nothing, didn't hear nothing, he said, arms crossed. That old man barely talked to me unless he was telling me to trim something. Miserable sod. But you were paid regularly, Drew said, glancing at the employment receipts. Edwin shrugged. He liked things just so. That's all. Miss Marple smiled gently. And yet he fired you last summer. That made Edwin blink. Only for a week. Then he took me back. He took you back, she echoed, after you shouted at him in the post office and threatened to cut the roses at the root, as it were. He was an old git, but I didn't kill him. You didn't have to, Miss Marple said softly. but someone who knew his habits, when he lit the fire, when he drank his tea, might have seen an opportunity. Edwin's silence said more than his denial had. After him came Mrs. Pritchard, the housekeeper. Short, wide, and perpetually red in the cheeks, she looked offended just by being summoned. "I only came Mondays and Thursdays," she said. "Kept the place tidy, made a bit of stew, that was all." "You didn't come the week of the murder?" "Number he said he'd be away." "Visiting someone in Oxford, I think." Miss Marple's brow lifted. "And did he go?" "Well, I never asked. He didn't like questions." "Did anyone else ever visit while you were there?" "Occasionally. The doctor, of course. Sometimes Miss Temple years ago. He had a nephew once. What was his name? Roger, I think. Always needed money." Drew scribbled something. "This Roger, does he live nearby?" "London, maybe. Or Manchester. One of those places." "And did Mr. Blaine mention changing his will to you?" "Ha, that man wouldn't leave a halfpenny to a church mouse. Said everyone just wanted his land." Miss Marple watched her closely. There was something off in her tone, resentment disguised as humour. When she left, Drew frowned. "No love lost, eh?" "She lied," Miss Marple said quietly. "About the Oxford trip." "You think so?" "She said he told her. He'd be away. But Edgar invited Clara that same evening. He clearly planned to be at home. Why lie, unless he wanted the house empty?" "Or unless someone else wanted it empty," Drew murmured. Then came the nephew, Roger Blaine. He'd arrived after hearing the news, all crocodile tears and theatrics. He wore a smart coat, but the lining was frayed. The sort of man who'd once had money but no longer did. "I hadn't seen Uncle Edgar in months," he said, wringing his hands. "I rang him around the holidays, of course, always tried to stay in touch. You know how family is." "And yet he never mentioned you," Drew said. Roger's smile tightened. "We had tensions. He didn't agree with how I lived." "Financial troubles?" Miss Marple asked gently. Roger sighed. "I invested poorly. A printing firm went bust. I may have asked Uncle Edgar for help. Once or twice." "Did he help?" "He said I'd learn more from falling than being caught." "And yet he left you something in the old will," Miss Marple said. Roger went very still. "Did he?" She nodded. "That will is now null, of course. The new one was unsigned." He looked away. "How unfortunate." Miss Marple rose then. "Thank you, Mr. Blaine. I believe that will be all." As the door shut behind him, Drew leaned back. "You think he did it?" "I think he wanted to," Miss Marple said. "But wanting and doing are different. No, Roger is too obvious." "So, who then?" Miss Marple steepled her fingers. "Consider the card, the misplaced ink, the overly clean hearth. Dr. Hayward may not have killed Blaine, but he helped cover it up. To protect someone? Yes, and that someone had to be close enough to influence him, to make him fear losing everything if the truth came out." She stood slowly. "Someone like Clara Temple." Drew frowned. "But she—" "Think. Clara was once engaged to Edgar. He ruined her reputation and broke off the engagement. But perhaps, just perhaps, she never forgave him. Perhaps the meeting that night was not for reconciliation, but revenge. You said she wasn't lying. Number not about visiting, but she never claimed he was alive when she arrived." Drew stood too. "You think she found him dead, and used that moment?" "I think she killed him, and I think Dr. Hayward, whether out of love or guilt, helped her hide the evidence." Outside, the snow began again, slow and silent. The voices had spoken, but one among them had deceived better than the rest. And Miss Marple would hear the truth, soon enough. The snow that had cloaked Chipping Dean in peaceful stillness now felt like a shroud, heavy, lingering, and quietly suffocating. The village, so small and known, seemed suddenly unfamiliar under suspicion. Every cottage window might hide a liar, every warm hearth a secret. And the murder of Edgar Blaine, so neatly wrapped in the confession of Dr. Hayward, was beginning to unravel, thread by thread. Miss Marple sat near the fire in the rectory lounge, a fresh pot of tea untouched beside her, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Her eyes weren't on the fire, but turned inward, sifting through what she had heard, what had been said too quickly, and what had not been said at all. Everyone had a motive, but no single motive fit the crime alone. It wasn't a clean-cut killing. It was layered, tangled, greed, revenge, jealousy, fear. Miss Marple had seen it before, not in murder necessarily, but in the small cruelties of village life. A slander whispered at market, a friendship broken by envy. People didn't act from one emotion, they acted from 5, all at once, pulling in different directions like threads in a poorly made jumper. She reached for her notebook and drew a line in the centre. Edgar Blaine, deceased. Then branching off like spokes on a wheel, she wrote each name. Clara Temple, former fiancée, publicly humiliated, invited that night, genuinely grieved, but oddly composed. Dr. Hayward, local physician, forger, willing to lie, possibly in love with Clara, possibly blackmailed. Roger Blaine, nephew, disinherited, desperate, crumbling financially, too performative, possibly waiting for Blaine to die naturally. Mrs. Pritchard, housekeeper, lied about Blaine's whereabouts, resentful, knew routines, knew when the house would be empty. Edwin Sharp, groundskeeper, fired and rehired, threatened Blaine publicly, new layout of house, claims ignorance. Each thread dangled close but not quite touching. Then she looked harder at the timing. That was where the deception lived, not just in who had motive, but in when the crime had been committed. Dr. Hayward had placed the time of death between 8 and 10 p.m., but who was seen and when? She recalled Edwin Sharp saying he'd seen a light in the study window at around 9:30, yet Clara said the fire was dying when she arrived, which suggested much earlier, around 8. Roger Blaine claimed he hadn't seen his uncle for months, but the postmaster mentioned Roger had sent a parcel to Chipping Dean just 3 days before the murder, under a false return address. And then there was Mrs. Pritchard's story. She'd said Edgar was going to Oxford, but he clearly wasn't. Why lie? Miss Marple drew a second web. Access. Clara still had a key. The housekeeper had one. The nephew, perhaps, if he'd stolen it on a previous visit. The doctor was trusted and could have let himself in with a fabricated pretense, and Edwin had done grounds work for years. Windows, sheds, and back doors were likely familiar to him. But none of that answered the question that still throbbed beneath it all. Why stage the Christmas card? That one act had triggered the whole unravelling. Without it, the crime might have remained unsolved or falsely pinned. That card was theatrical, intimate, intended not for the police, but for Clara, which meant the killer wanted Clara to know something, or Clara herself had wanted someone to believe it had come from Edgar. She tapped her pencil on the card in her memory. Sent posthumously with apologies. Too clever. Too clean. Clara, perhaps, had written it. That seemed likely now. But when? Before or after the murder? And why add with apologies? A final gesture of closure, or a calculated attempt to shift suspicion? She stood and put on her coat. The answers weren't in theory. They were in people. She found Roger Blaine in the pub. He looked tired, the act wearing off. His clothes were more wrinkled than expensive now, and his drink half empty. "Miss Marple," he said, standing too quickly, trying to play polite. "Do sit. Let me buy you a sherry." "No need," she said softly. "I won't keep you long. I was only wondering about the parcel you sent Edgar 3 days before the murder." Roger went very still. "I don't know what you mean." "Mr. Harkness at the post office remembers you. You used the name J. Carrow, but signed for priority postage. Was it a gift, a letter, or something you didn't want traced?" She tilted her head. "You must understand. We already know, Doctor. Hayward forged the will. But he didn't kill Edgar. That means someone else did. Someone with something to gain." Roger's voice dropped. "If I did send something, it wasn't important. That's for the police to decide." His fingers gripped the glass. "It was just a bluff," he whispered. "I sent him a fake blackmail note, pretended I knew he'd changed the will. I thought he'd panic, maybe give me money to shut me up, but I didn't kill him. I didn't even see him." "And if he called your bluff?" Roger looked away. "Then I lost, but I didn't strangle the man." She watched him closely. He believed it. He wasn't brave enough to lie about murder. She left him and walked to Clara Temple's cottage. Clara opened the door with a faint smile, but something was different. A vase was missing from the mantel, a photo turned face down, and her voice had the sharpness of someone trying too hard to be gentle. "I've heard Dr. Hayward was arrested," she said. "I suppose it's over." "I don't believe it is." Clara tilted her head. "No?" "Number, because I think you visited Edgar earlier than you claimed. Perhaps just after dusk, when the roads were quiet. You still had a key. You entered, perhaps expecting peace, but it turned to violence. You're accusing me again?" "Number, I believe you found him alive and left him dead." Clara's face froze. "I believe Edgar told you he was not changing the will in your favour, that his apology was only a ploy, and you realised the last 30 years had been for nothing." Clara stepped back, her hand resting lightly on the doorframe. "And I believe you didn't plan to kill him, but you did." Her mouth trembled, but she didn't speak. Miss Marple's voice lowered. "And afterward I think you called someone you knew would protect you, a man who loved you, who came quickly, who saw what you had done, who erased the clues." Clara's shoulders sank. "I never meant for it to happen." "I know." Silence. Miss Marple turned gently. "The truth always finds its way through, Clara, like sunlight through frost. Even the best lies melt in time." And as the door closed softly behind her, the threads of motive, revenge, guilt, love, desperation, finally wove into something whole. But the heart of it had not been hatred. It had been longing, buried too long beneath years of silence. And when it surfaced at last, it had come too late. Too late for apologies, too late for forgiveness, and far, far too late for Edgar Blaine. Detective Inspector Craddock stood before the gathered press at the front steps of the Dower House, a slight smile playing on his lips as he held up a sealed envelope encased in a plastic sleeve. "This," he said, "was found hidden behind a loose brick in the fireplace of Mr. Jerome Greaves's study. It's a confession, dated 3 days before his death." Flashbulbs burst. Reporters scribbled. In the front row, Miss Marple tilted her head ever so slightly, the edge of her knitting trembling. She wasn't fond of theatrical conclusions, especially not ones that came too easily. She had seen too many tidy stories unravel at the hem. The letter was, indeed, explosive. In it, Jerome Greaves confessed to swindling money from his own investment company, all in the name of a secret affair with a woman he never named. He expressed shame, remorse, and a clear intent to end his own life before being exposed. It seemed to confirm everything: why his safe was empty, why the doors were locked, why there was no sign of struggle, an open and shut suicide. But 2 things bothered Miss Marple. First, Jerome Greaves had never struck her as a man who would take responsibility for his sins. Second, and more pressing, the Christmas card. She revisited it that afternoon. It remained on the mantelpiece in the lounge, sealed in an evidence bag. "To Audrey," it read in Greaves' unmistakable angular script. "Merry Christmas, my dear. I'll see you on Boxing Day." But Jerome Greaves had died the morning before Christmas, and even if he had written the card in advance, there was one undeniable fact. Audrey had claimed to receive it in the post after the body was found. Miss Marple approached Inspector Craddock privately that evening. "Such a marvellous breakthrough," she began politely, "though I suppose the timing of the letter is unfortunate. To write a suicide note 3 days in advance, one might forget such things, don't you think?" Craddock exhaled. "You're not convinced?" "I never am," she said gently, "until I am. But we've tested the paper, the ink, the handwriting. It's genuine." "Oh, I don't doubt that. But, tell me, was there any sign of dust on the envelope?" He blinked. "What?" "If it had been hidden behind a brick for days, there would be at least some soot or ash residue, wouldn't you say?" Craddock's face darkened. "I'll have them retest it." The village exhaled that night. Most took comfort in the case being over. At the Bell and Thistle, they toasted the man they'd never really liked and whispered about his shameful end. Audrey Thorne, for her part, retreated to her cottage and wasn't seen the rest of the day. Nor was Alan Vaughan. Miss Marple remained at the Dower House with her niece Judith. While the police combed over the Greaves home one last time, Miss Marple asked a simple question. "Has anyone checked the local post office log?" Judith blinked. "For what?" "Outgoing cards." The next morning, the vicar's wife, who had a rather chatty friendship with the postmistress, passed along a curious fact. On Christmas Eve, a man had posted a stack of cards just before closing. She remembered him well, for he had asked for one of the fancier stamps. His name, she believed, was Alan Vaughan. Inspector Craddock received the news just as the lab results returned. The envelope containing the suicide note had no traces of soot, ash, or dust. It had not been inside a chimney for even an hour, let alone 3 days. It had been planted. Craddock returned to the Dower House in a silent fury. He ordered Vaughan brought in, but the man was gone. His flat was abandoned, his car missing, and his landlady claimed he had gone to visit family in London. Craddock cursed himself. He had been so sure. Too sure. Miss Marple, however, sat with her tea unruffled. "It's rather sad, really," she said, staring at the empty hearth. "To fake a suicide to cover a murder, it's a cruel thing, but clever. And posting a Christmas card from a dead man? That takes nerve, or desperation." Craddock sat across from her, rubbing his brow. "You think Vaughan forged the letter?" "I do, but I don't think he was the only one involved. No, this had the feel of a plan patched together quickly, with one crucial mistake." She gestured toward the fireplace. "Greaves died in that room. I've always suspected it, though the medical examiner claimed he was likely shot in the study. But if the shot was fired from behind while he was seated, then the killer would need to move him without leaving blood," Craddock said, finishing her thought. "Precisely." Craddock's radio crackled. One of his men had found something. Behind the panelled wall near the back study, a clean tarp, rope fibres, and faint traces of blood. Miss Marple nodded. "They staged the body," she murmured, "shot him in the study, cleaned it, and posed him in the lounge to suggest suicide. But they forgot about the card. They forgot that Jerome Greaves wouldn't have written to a woman he'd just argued with. And they forgot that soot and dust tell their own stories. The evidence shifted everything. The fake suicide note, the missing funds, the false card. Each one a crafted illusion, leading the investigation away from murder. And it had nearly worked. But with Vaughan missing, the pressure returned. Miss Marple turned her attention to the remaining players. Audrey Thorne, fragile yet oddly composed. Henry, the brother-in-law who had so much to gain. Even young Jessica, with her uncanny ability to appear when least expected. Motives lay thick on the ground. But someone had written that note. Someone had helped move the body. Someone had posted that card. And Miss Marple was certain it wasn't just Alan Vaughan. Not by a long shot. The early morning light filtered weakly through frost-lined windows of the village library, where Miss Marple sat nestled amid the dusty stacks of local history. Her fingers traced the yellowed edges of an old newspaper, the Chipping Den Gazette from 20 years ago. She had taken to visiting this quiet sanctuary often during the long nights of the investigation, seeking patterns hidden beneath years of village life. As the world outside prepared for the slow thaw of winter, Miss Marple's mind churned over the recent developments, the forged letter, the disappearing Alan Vaughan, the shadowy connections threading between Audrey Thorne, Roger Blaine, and Dr. Hayward. They were all tangled, but how? And why? Her eyes caught an article with a faded headline. "Village Scandal. The Withers Estate Heir Found Dead." The date, almost exactly 2 decades prior to the current murder. She read on. Jonathan Withers, heir to the vast Withers estate just beyond the village borders, had been found drowned in the mill pond under suspicious circumstances. Ruled an accident at the time, the case had quietly closed, leaving behind rumours of gambling debts, family quarrels, and a mysterious disappearance of a valuable heirloom necklace. The story was long forgotten, except among a few old villagers whose memories flickered like candlelight. Miss Marple leaned back and thought, what if this tragedy was more than a mere coincidence? What if the past was reaching its cold fingers into the present? She cross-referenced names. Audrey Thorne, then Audrey Withers, had been Jonathan's younger sister. Roger Blaine had been a close friend of the family, and Dr. Hayward had served as the family physician back then. The ties were tighter than anyone suspected. Returning to the rectory, Miss Marple pulled out her worn notebook. She noted the common threads: jealousy, inheritance disputes, and secrets kept under lock and key. Audrey's guarded demeanour suddenly made sense. She was not just the fragile widow of today. She was the daughter of old wounds and long-held grudges. Miss Marple called on Audrey that afternoon. The widow answered with a cautious smile, as if expecting an intrusion. "I've been reading about your family," Miss Marple began gently. "The loss of your brother, Jonathan, all those years ago." Audrey's eyes flickered, but she said nothing. It must have been difficult, and perhaps there are things you wish had been clearer or better understood. Audrey's hands clenched the edge of her chair. "Jonathan's death changed everything. Our family was never the same." "Did you ever wonder if it was truly an accident?" Miss Marple asked softly. Audrey swallowed. There were whispers, but nothing was ever proven. My father insisted on silence. "And the heirloom? The Withers necklace? Was it ever found? Number lost to the depths? Or stolen?" Miss Marple nodded. Sometimes the past does not rest quietly. She left Audrey with a promise to look deeper. Next, she sought out Roger Blaine. At the village cafe, he seemed distracted, glancing nervously at the door. "I hear you knew the Withers family well," Miss Marple said, sliding into the seat opposite him. Roger gave a tight smile. "Jonathan was a friend. We grew up together. But that friendship ended badly." "How so?" "There was money owed, debts, and something about the necklace. Jonathan believed it was taken from the family vault, and he accused me of being involved." "You deny it?" "Absolutely. But when Jonathan died, people stopped asking questions. I was left to bear the blame." Miss Marple saw the pain beneath his words. "And Dr. Hayward?" she asked. "Did he have a role in this old affair?" Roger hesitated. "He was loyal to the Withers family. Perhaps too loyal. There were nights he came to visit Jonathan after hours when no one else was around." That night, Miss Marple met with Inspector Drew, sharing her discoveries. Together they pulled old case files, comparing faded photographs and witness statements. A pattern emerged. Dr. Hayward had been the keeper of secrets, the silent guardian of the Withers family's darkest moments. His presence at Edgar Blaine's murder was no coincidence. He had been protecting a legacy, one rooted in betrayal and loss decades before. The tangled web was tighter now, the motives more complex. The crime no longer just about greed or jealousy, but about buried truths seeking light. Miss Marple's gaze settled on a faded photograph of the Withers siblings. Two faces smiled back, Jonathan vibrant and full of life, and Audrey, fragile but determined. Their story was unfinished, and so was the case in Chippingdale. Outside, winter's chill deepened, but inside the quiet rectory a fire of determination burned bright. The past was no longer forgotten. It was waiting. The chill of early evening crept through the narrow streets of Chippingdale as Miss Marple made her way back to the village hall, a place usually reserved for bingo nights and parish meetings. Tonight, however, it was the unlikely stage for her newest approach to the tangled mystery that refused to yield. The villagers had grown weary of the endless questions, the slow churning of suspicions, and the cold shadow hanging over them all since Edgar Blaine's death. Yet Miss Marple was convinced that beneath the layers of deceit and whispered alibis, a small, overlooked truth lay waiting to be unearthed, not in facts or physical evidence, but in human nature itself. She had invited the remaining key suspects under the pretense of a communal reading of old letters from the Withers family archives, a subtle ploy designed to unsettle. The invitation was casual, almost innocent, and all had accepted, some with reluctance, others with curiosity. Inside the hall, a circle of chairs had been arranged, and a small table stood at its centre with a box of old photographs and documents. The atmosphere was tense but controlled, the kind of quiet that buzzes with unspoken accusations. Miss Marple began by reading aloud from a letter penned decades ago, describing a family dispute over an heirloom necklace, the very necklace that had resurfaced in whispered tales tied to the present crime. As she spoke, she observed her guests carefully. Clara Temple, her fingers nervously twisting a handkerchief. Roger Blaine, whose jaw tightened with each mention of the Withers name, Audrey Thorne, eyes distant but attentive, and even Dr. Hayward, who appeared composed but betrayed the slightest twitch in his left eyebrow. When the letter ended, Miss Marple posed a simple question to the group. If you had to choose, which of you do you believe held the deepest secret? The one capable of silencing Jonathan Withers so long ago, and perhaps silencing Edgar Blaine as well? The room was silent. No one spoke. The question hung like a candle's flame in still air. Then Miss Marple smiled gently and continued. Sometimes our memories play tricks, but our hearts betray truths we try to hide. I'd like to try something, a small exercise to help us uncover what we may not say aloud. She handed each person a small card with a single word written on it. Truth, lies, fear, love, and revenge. She asked them to write the name of the person they thought best embodied that word. One by one, the cards were collected, folded, and shuffled, then read aloud. The results were telling. Fear pointed to Dr. Hayward. Love was given to Clara Temple. Revenge named Roger Blaine. Truth, surprisingly, was awarded to Audrey Thorne, and lies was whispered toward a seat at the edge, the empty chair once belonging to Alan Vaughan. The room shifted. Eyes flicked between one another, unease growing. Miss Marple turned to Dr. Hayward first. Doctor, fear is a powerful motivator. What is it that you fear most? He hesitated, then said quietly, losing control. And control over what? The people I care for, the secrets I keep. She nodded. And yet secrets, like fires, can spread beyond our grasp. Clara Temple's eyes met Miss Marple's. Love can make us blind, she said softly, or sharp enough to cut. Roger Blaine looked away. Revenge is a cold thing, he muttered. I'm tired of it. Miss Marple smiled. Thank you, that was revealing. But then her gaze settled on Audrey Thorne. The woman's hands were clenched tightly, knuckles white. Miss Marple's intuition flared. There is something you're not telling us, Audrey. Something from the past that binds you to this night more closely than you admit. Audrey's composure cracked ever so slightly. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and her eyes flickered to the doorway as if expecting someone, or something, to intervene. Would you care to share? Miss Marple asked gently. Audrey exhaled. It's true, the Withers family held many secrets, but I never wanted to be part of this, of revenge or greed. Yet you benefited from the silence, Miss Marple pressed. Your inheritance, your standing. Someone had to keep the truth buried. Audrey's voice faltered. I did what I had to. Miss Marple's smile softened. And now, it seems, the past has come calling. As the evening drew to a close, Miss Marple remained seated, considering the reactions. The exercise, though simple, had cracked the facade of calm, revealing fissures in the suspects' carefully maintained masks. One subtle detail lingered in her mind, the way Audrey had glanced toward the door when questioned, as if waiting for someone to arrive or for time to pass. And that meant the real truth, the heart of the deception, was still hidden in the shadows, biding its moment. But for Miss Marple, the game was far from over. The final move was still to come. The morning air hung heavy with frost as Miss Marple arrived at the village police station, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. The latest discovery from the ongoing investigation promised to be a turning point. A diary belonging to Edgar Blaine, found concealed behind a loose panel in the Dower House library. Inspector Craddock had summoned her urgently the night before, his voice tinged with excitement and hope. At last, a direct insight into the victim's thoughts. Inside the dimly lit evidence room, the diary lay on the metal table under a protective sheet. Miss Marple lifted it carefully, fingers tracing the worn leather cover. The entries were personal, candid, detailing days of fear, suspicion, and despair. There were mentions of threats, secrets, and betrayals that could finally untangle the web around Blaine's murder. But before she could delve deeper, a sudden commotion shattered the quiet. A constable burst into the room, pale-faced and out of breath. Miss Marple, Inspector Craddock. There's been a problem. The diary. It's gone. Miss Marple froze. Gone? The constable nodded grimly. From the locked evidence locker. The door was found ajar this morning. No sign of forced entry, but the diary is missing. And worse, the only other item in the locker, the original Christmas card, was slashed to pieces. A cold wave washed over her. "This was no accident," she murmured. "Someone wants the truth buried." The news spread swiftly through Chipping Dean. At the village pub, whispers turned to accusations. The fragile trust that had begun to form between villagers and investigators shattered like glass. Inspector Craddock convened an emergency meeting with Miss Marple and the core team. "We're dealing with an insider," he stated bluntly. "Someone with access, knowledge, and a vested interest." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And someone desperate." Their list of suspects narrowed sharply. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pritchard, still retained keys. Dr. Hayward's close relationship with the family gave him access. Even Clara Temple, with her frequent visits, couldn't be ruled out. But Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Audrey Thorne. The way she had glanced nervously during their last meeting lingered in her mind. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid Audrey a visit under the guise of friendship and concern. Audrey greeted her with a forced smile, but her eyes betrayed unease. Over tea, Miss Marple carefully steered the conversation toward the missing items. "Such a terrible blow, isn't it? For the investigation, I mean." Audrey nodded. "It makes me wonder how much people will go to protect secrets. And yet, sometimes secrets want to be found." Audrey's hands trembled slightly. "I only want peace." Miss Marple reached out, placing a reassuring hand on hers. "Peace comes from truth, dear, even if it stings." Before Audrey could respond, a sharp knock echoed through the door. A young constable entered, breathless. "Miss Marple, Inspector Craddock requests your presence immediately. There's been another development." They hurried to the station, where Craddock waited with grim news. The police had intercepted a messenger bound for London, carrying fragments of the shredded Christmas card, carefully wrapped, along with a hastily scrawled note, "Truth dies with the dead." Miss Marple's gaze hardened. The game had escalated beyond petty deception. Someone was orchestrating a campaign to silence the investigation, to strike fear into those who dared seek answers. The detective's mind raced. Who stood to gain the most from burying the past? Who had the influence and cunning to manipulate both police and villagers? She thought of Roger Blaine's desperation, Clara's restrained sorrow, Dr. Hayward's guarded loyalty, and Audrey's fractured past. Each was a thread tangled in the same dark fabric. But one detail gnawed at her, the unusual timing. The diary had been found only hours before its disappearance. Whoever took it had acted swiftly with inside knowledge. Miss Marple knew the stakes had shifted. The murderer, or their accomplice, was still watching, waiting for the right moment to strike again. As dusk fell over Chipping Dean, the detective felt the weight of the coming days. Trust was fragile and truth more elusive than ever. Yet she was determined. No shadow would hide forever. The game was far from over. The rain returned to Chipping Dean with a vengeance. It hammered the streets in icy sheets, washing the village in a cold grey haze. Shop fronts dimmed, footsteps quickened, and behind every drawn curtain, whispers bloomed like mould. The tension that had crept into the village since Edgar Blaine's murder now hung suffocatingly thick, its grip only tightening after the disappearance of the diary and the destruction of the slashed Christmas card. Miss Marple had seen many villages under strain, but this was different. This was rot, and rot spreads. It was just past 7 when the second murder was discovered. The young constable who found him, Constable Beale, had gone to the vicarage to retrieve a misplaced key record. The door was ajar. He called out twice. No answer. Then, in the study, behind the desk where Reverend Lionel Cummings wrote his weekly sermons, he found the body. Blood soaked the cleric's white collar. A single stab wound, deliberate, almost surgical, had ended his life. His hand still gripped the edge of the desk, as if trying to rise in his final moments. On the floor beside him was a silver letter opener. Inspector Craddock stood beside the body an hour later, jaw clenched, face pale. Miss Marple, too, arrived at the scene, escorted in silence by Audrey Thorne, who had come to light candles for evening prayers, only to find the police swarming the vicarage. Craddock looked up as Miss Marple entered the study. "Same pattern," he muttered. "Minimal struggle, controlled, a clean job, almost professional." Miss Marple bent over the desk, noting the smudged ink on the Reverend's blotter and a fresh sheet of paper half tucked under a hymn book. She slid it free. It was a half-finished letter, meant for someone. Possibly for her. To whomever finds this, know that what was taken was never mine to keep. I held the secret too long. The ink trailed off, cut short mid-sentence. Craddock read over her shoulder and cursed softly. He knew something. Something worth killing for. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, or something he finally refused to hide. The investigation spiraled into chaos. The village was no longer just the scene of a single murder. It was now gripped by the fear of a killer still at large, one bold enough to strike again. And this time, it was no reclusive millionaire, no enigmatic stranger. It was the local vicar, a beloved figure, a man known for his gentleness and trust. His death shattered what little composure remained in the village. The ripple effects were immediate. Clara Temple collapsed in sobs in the arms of Dr. Hayward, her longtime friend. He was the only one Edgar trusted, she wept, and now he's gone too. Roger Blaine demanded police. Protection. Someone's targeting the family, he insisted. It started with Edgar. Now the Reverend? Who's next? Me? And Audrey Thorne, strangely, grew quieter, withdrawn. She no longer responded to Miss Marple's visits with warmth, but instead watched the old woman with a cool, guarded expression. Miss Marple noted all of it. She said little, but she was watching too. That evening, Miss Marple requested something odd from Inspector Craddock, access to the parish's old ledgers. Edgar's death wasn't the beginning, she said, and Lionel's wasn't the end. Whatever truth lies beneath this tangle, it's older than this Christmas, older than you and I. Craddock, used to her eccentricities by now, complied. In the quiet sanctuary of the church office, surrounded by brittle pages and fading ink, Miss Marple began tracing names, dates, donations, and records of confession, meticulously logged over the years. And there she found it, a name that had surfaced in the margins of both Edgar Blaine's personal letters and the vicar's notes. Walter Bexley. She froze. Walter Bexley had been a groundskeeper decades ago, a quiet man, vanished after a scandal involving the Dower House estate and rumours of blackmail. His name had been buried, just like everything else Edgar tried to hide. But why had it resurfaced now? The answer came not in the form of an epiphany, but a gunshot. A single crack echoed across the night sky, then screams. Miss Marple turned toward the window in time to see a figure staggering out from the woods near the Dower House. A man, blood streaming from his shoulder, and the shooter, already gone. The injured man collapsed at the church gate. It was Dr. Hayward. Later, in the small surgery where Hayward was being treated, Miss Marple hovered quietly as Craddock questioned him. "I don't know who it was," the doctor muttered, grimacing through the pain. "I was walking the perimeter, thinking, clearing my head. Then something hit me. My shoulder burned. I fell. I didn't see their face." Miss Marple leaned forward. "But you heard something?" Hayward hesitated, then nodded. "A whistle. 3 sharp notes, like someone calling a dog." Craddock frowned. "No one walks dogs up there anymore." Miss Marple stood still as stone. She remembered something, a fleeting memory from earlier that week. A porcelain whistle on Audrey Thorne's mantelpiece, ornamental, supposedly her late brother's from his school days. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. This was no longer about solving one murder. It was about stopping another before it happened. They were out of time. Someone was eliminating anyone who knew the old secrets, and Miss Marple feared that she might be next. It was a heavy morning mist that cloaked the village, draping St. Mary Mead in a hush of anticipation. The sun fought to break through, and for once even the birds seemed to hold their breath. Miss Marple sat in her usual corner of the vicarage drawing-room, tea growing cold in its cup, eyes narrowed on a single line she jotted in her notebook, a string of words that, for nearly a week, had haunted her like a half-remembered hymn. Why would a dead man sign his own Christmas card? But now something shifted. The clues, disjointed as they were, had finally begun to settle into place, like bits of frost falling into a mosaic. The sudden death of Geoffrey Lonsdale, The solicitor, with too many secrets and too few friends, had thrown the entire village into disarray. The Christmas card he had supposedly sent, postmarked after his time of death, had first appeared a distraction, a novelty. But Miss Marple knew better. In her experience, murder rarely wore such finery without purpose. It was a conversation from the previous day that turned the key in her mind. Young Inspector Cray had mentioned it offhandedly, perhaps hoping to appear clever. Funny thing, really. You'd think a man like Lonsdale, so fussy, would use matching envelopes for his cards. But the one sent to Colonel Arkwright had a plain white one, not embossed like the others. Plain white, plain. Miss Marple stood, abandoning her tea. The word plain had stayed with her. So had something Nora Sedgwick, the late solicitor's assistant, had said during a hurried confession of sorts. Something about Lonsdale being irritated that she'd used the wrong batch. Nora had meant the envelopes, she claimed, but what if she hadn't? At the edge of the village she visited the postmistress, who had never denied Miss Marple her inquiries, especially when they were framed as something neighbourly and harmless. "Oh, yes," the woman nodded, brushing toast crumbs off her sweater. "I remember that lot of cards going out. Lonsdale's were always fancier than most. Green seal, cream vellum. But one of them, a late one, was different. Handwritten address, too." Different how? No seal. Looked almost rushed, as though someone else had popped it in last minute. Someone else. It hit her then. Back at the vicarage, Miss Marple rifled through her notes. There had been another oddity that had stuck with her, one she hadn't had the sense to recognise for what it was. The peculiar timing of the phone call Geoffrey had supposedly made to schedule a luncheon with Arkwright the day before his death. Arkwright claimed Geoffrey had phoned him, sounding oddly cheery. But his housekeeper had insisted Mr. Lonsdale had spent that entire morning in silence, his study door locked, speaking to no one. And Nora, who had been in the office that day, had also confirmed Geoffrey hadn't picked up the phone once. Two contradictory statements, one lie. Why would someone impersonate a phone call after Lonsdale was dead? To establish a timeline, a false one, which meant the killer had access not only to Lonsdale's office, but to his correspondence, his phone, and more importantly, his handwriting. And suddenly the sloppy last-minute envelope wasn't a careless act at all. It was a deliberate mistake, a misdirection. Whoever sent it wanted to ensure the card arrived after the murder, but with just enough irregularity to cast doubt, not certainty. So they forged the signature. The killer wasn't hiding the card. They wanted it found. A pattern was forming, one steeped in appearances, the way things looked versus the way they truly were. And at the centre of it all was someone who knew how to move among the village like a ghost, ever present, ever unnoticed. Miss Marple returned to the list of suspects and found her eyes resting on the one name that had seemed too peripheral, too unimportant. Martin Fell, the quiet, pale-faced archivist who'd been hired to catalogue Lonsdale's records the month before. Everyone had thought him harmless, shy, a nephew of someone or other in town, but Martin had been in and out of that office daily, often alone, especially on weekends. He'd barely spoken during the interviews, said he hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. But there had been a moment, one Miss Marple had nearly dismissed, when he'd corrected someone on a trivial legal matter with a sharpness that didn't match his demeanour. How would a simple archivist know so much about the inheritance laws Geoffrey had been working on? Unless he wasn't an archivist, unless he was a beneficiary, or someone close to one. Quick as breath, Miss Marple contacted the local records office under the guise of checking village land transfers. The archivist on duty, a friend of hers from her gardening club, confirmed what she feared. No Martin Fell on staff here. Never has been. Miss Marple returned to her fireside chair, heart ticking with soft certainty. Someone had posed as an archivist to gain access to Geoffrey's documents, to control what came in, what went out, and, most chillingly, what could be destroyed. And when Geoffrey caught on, he died. The Christmas card wasn't a message from the dead. It was a footprint in the snow, clumsy and damning. A hamisit vanet Geoffrey elet ben letezeset, bizon yitani hostak, miutan mar halot volt. But Miss Marple now knew better. The man had never signed that card. He never made that call. Someone had used his voice, his hand, and his reputation to build an alibi, then erase him. The truth, she realized, was already coiling toward its inevitable revelation, but before it could fully emerge, she needed one more piece. Who stood to gain from Geoffrey's death? A review of his client files, kept meticulous in the vicarage's spare study, showed an obscure entry. Name: Charlotte Lynn, an old case, long dormant. But Charlotte Lynn was Martin Fell's mother, a woman known years ago for a bitter inheritance dispute that Geoffrey Lonsdale had resolved. Harshly. The family had lost everything: reputation, property, money, and Martin had waited, bided his time, slipped into St. Mary Mead with a false name and an old grudge. Murder, after all, needn't be hurried. Now Miss Marple only had to prove it. The final card, it seemed, was yet to be played. Miss Marple sat quietly in the vicarage parlour, her knitting resting idly in her lap, though not a stitch had moved in several minutes. Her eyes, clouded by age but sharpened by decades of human observation, were narrowed, not with judgment, but curiosity. Her mind, undistracted by the trivial chatter of daily life, had finally arrived at the centre of the labyrinth. The motive, which had evaded clear understanding through twists of money, affairs, and ambition, now stood revealed not with a flourish, but with quiet devastation. It had begun with a Christmas card, innocuous, festive, and cheerful. A card signed by a man who, at the time of its delivery, had already been dead for 3 days. Everything had seemed to point toward forgery, deception, an impersonator perhaps, yet no fingerprints other than the deceased's had been found on the card or the envelope. The handwriting had matched beyond doubt, and that incongruity had gnawed at Miss Marple's instincts from the start. She now understood. It had not been a forgery. Victor Denham had indeed signed that card, but not as a holiday greeting. It was his last desperate attempt to communicate, and it had not been meant for the recipient at all. She rose from the parlour chair and made her way to the Denham house one final time. Inspector Craddock, wearied but respectful of her insights, let her in without objection. The air inside the house felt heavier now, as though the past clung to the wallpaper and the curtains. Miss Marple gestured to the inspector and the remaining suspects, gathered like anxious birds on a wire. Clara Denham, the widow who had cried too perfectly. Henry Balfour, the family solicitor with polished shoes and murky ethics. Michael Ames, the nephew with the gambling debts. And Evelyn Ford, the demure secretary whose eyes never missed a detail. "Let us consider not just what was done," Miss Marple began, "but why it had to be done so carefully." They listened. Victor Denham's fortune was considerable, she continued, but he was not a man driven solely by money. He valued control, secrets, appearances, and he feared one thing more than death: shame. Michael shifted uncomfortably. Clara reached for her handkerchief. Evelyn remained still. But someone knew something buried deep, and that person threatened to ruin him, not for profit, not for revenge, but for love twisted by guilt. She turned toward Clara. "You loved Victor once, truly, but not recently. You stayed because of the lifestyle, because he allowed you freedom, in return for your silence. You knew what he had done as a younger man. What happened during that summer in Cannes, did you not?" Clara's knuckles whitened around her handkerchief, but she said nothing. "The girl's name was Lisette," Miss Marple went on, her voice soft. "She disappeared. Her family never found her. Victor covered it up. Paid people. He was clever, ruthless. But Clara, you knew." "Prove it," Clara hissed through clenched teeth. "I don't need to," Miss Marple said gently. "The letter Lisette wrote before she vanished, the one that mentioned Victor by name, was found in your jewellery box. And more curiously, you kept it all these years, not out of spite, out of fear." She turned then to Evelyn Ford. "You were Lisette's younger sister, weren't you?" For the first time, Evelyn flinched, her silence shattered. "Yes," she whispered, "but I was a child when she vanished. My parents died not knowing what happened to her. I only discovered the truth 2 years ago, when I joined this house. When I found Clara's letter, the room chilled. You bided your time," Miss Marple said, "earning trust, positioning yourself near Victor. but I do not think you intended to kill him." "No," Evelyn said, her voice low. "I only wanted him to confess, to acknowledge what he had done, but he refused. He laughed, said she was a silly girl who asked for trouble, that she was forgettable." Her hands trembled now. "I confronted him. He became violent. I didn't mean to. He fell, hit his head on the marble hearth." Inspector Craddock looked stunned, but Miss Marple raised a hand. "That part I suspected. But what I needed to know was why the Christmas card. Why send it after he had died?" "I didn't send it," Evelyn said quickly. "I couldn't. I left him there, and panicked. I didn't even know about the card." Miss Marple smiled, though it was tinged with sorrow. "Because he had already sent it himself," she said. "It wasn't just any card. It was a message to himself. You see, the card was addressed not to a friend, but to the very man he feared, Mr. Henry Balfour." All heads turned. "You threatened Victor, didn't you?" Miss Marple asked, her eyes now on the solicitor. "Threatened to reveal Lizette's fate, perhaps hoping to pressure him into altering the will in your favour. But Victor refused. Instead, he drafted a new will, one you didn't know about, leaving everything to Evelyn." "That's absurd," Balfour snapped, though a sheen of sweat dotted his brow. "Is it? Victor mailed that card to you as a warning, something only you would understand. It bore no festive message, only a single word inside. Lisette." Craddock swore under his breath. "It was a declaration of war," Miss Marple said, and perhaps he intended to survive long enough to follow through. But fate, or Evelyn's panicked struggle, ensured he did not. She stepped back, letting the silence stretch. Victor Denham died because of a buried crime he never atoned for. Clara preserved his secret out of selfish comfort. Henry Balfour sought to exploit it. And Evelyn sought justice for a sister the world had forgotten. Evelyn wept now, silent and shattered. Inspector Craddock approached quietly and laid a gentle hand on her shoulder. "There will be a trial," he said, not unkindly. "But Miss Marple's testimony will carry weight." As they escorted Evelyn away, Clara turned to the window, her face blank, her empire of silence crumbling. Miss Marple gathered her knitting once more, the weight of truth settling over the room like snow. Outside, the last of the Christmas lights flickered. The card remained on the mantel, innocent in appearance, damning in intent. And in the quiet that followed, St. Mary Mead returned to its usual stillness, the echo of a long-buried voice finally heard. The storm outside seemed to pause, as though the world itself were holding its breath. Inside the Langford estate, the walls echoed with silence, dense and waiting, like the final moment before a gunshot. Miss Marple stood in the great hall, posture composed, eyes sharp behind the mild gleam of her spectacles. Before her stood Ernest Vale, the once affable secretary, hands trembling ever so slightly at his sides. He had come willingly, though not without hesitation. A dozen faces from the investigation, Inspector Green, Lady Langford, Mrs. Elspeth Blore, the maid Gertie, and even young Julian, watched from the periphery like reluctant witnesses to a drama they had not scripted. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "You see, Mr. Vale, it wasn't the will, or the ink, or even the odd time on the clock that unravelled it all. It was you, or rather, your compulsion to control how the story was told." He said nothing, but something flickered in his eyes. "You told us, early on, that you arrived at the estate at 8 o'clock the night before the body was found," she continued. "You insisted that the fire in the hearth was already burning. You described the scent of burning cedar and the way it reminded you of past winters. All very vivid, almost poetic." "Is this a crime?" he muttered, barely audible. "No," said Miss Marple, smiling softly, "but it is a lie." A rustle swept through the room like a gust of wind. "You see, the fire wasn't lit that night. Julian, poor dear, attempted to start one the next morning before the housekeeper stopped him. Gertie remembers the attempt quite well. She cleaned the hearth herself and noted the absence of ashes. That fire had not been lit in days." Miss Marple stepped forward. "Which means you weren't here when you said you were. And if you weren't here, then you had time. Time to do what needed doing. Time to tamper with the study. Time to—" deliver a card signed by a dead man. Ernest Vale paled. His voice, when it came, was hollow. "You've no proof." "No, perhaps not the kind you mean. But I do have a pattern, a thread. You lied about your arrival. You tried to steer the focus toward Lady Langford's finances, toward Julian's inheritance. You played the loyal servant, eager to help, but always just behind the action, never quite where you claimed to be. Always within reach of the evidence, yet never directly connected." She turned, addressing the room. Ernest Vale resented Charles Langford. He was not just the secretary. He was once the confidant, perhaps even the equal. But when the Langfords fell upon hard times, Charles did not tighten his belt as Ernest had. He sold pieces of the estate. He dismissed old staff. He began to treat his lifelong secretary as help, not a peer. Inspector Green crossed his arms. "A motive rooted in pride, then?" "No," Miss Marple said, "not just pride. Desperation. Ernest had embezzled funds years ago, a fact Charles discovered recently. There were whispers of blackmail, threats. Charles was going to expose him. Ernest couldn't allow that. Not after all these years." Lady Langford blinked, stunned. "Is that true?" Ernest Vale looked around at the faces arrayed against him, some horrified, others quietly pitying. His shoulders sagged. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said. "I only wanted him to see what it felt like to lose everything, to be humiliated. I forged the Christmas card to confuse things, make it look like someone else had been in contact, someone with a different grudge. But he wouldn't be reasoned with. He laughed in my face when I begged him not to go to the authorities." He turned to Miss Marple, voice trembling. "You don't understand what it's like to serve someone for 25 years and be thrown aside like rubbish." Miss Marple regarded him kindly but without sympathy. "Oh, but I do understand loneliness, and I understand bitterness. What I do not understand is murder." The silence returned, thick and final. Inspector Green moved forward, reciting the formal words of arrest. But Miss Marple no longer listened. She was watching the room, Lady Langford crumpling into a chair the way Julian stared blankly at the hearth, the way the storm had begun again outside, wind hissing across the moors like an ancient breath. Later, in the stillness of the drawing-room, the detective sat with a cup of tea and one of Gertie's sugar biscuits. Lady Langford joined her, eyes red but composed. "Why did he do it, really?" she asked. "Surely, it couldn't just be about money and pride." Miss Marple looked into her tea as though it might reveal another layer of the truth. "Loneliness, Lady Langford, is a terrible thing. It can curdle the soul. Mr. Vale had built his entire life around a man who no longer needed him. When he realized he had no family, no prospects, no legacy of his own, he chose to destroy the thing that had rejected him, not out of rage, out of absence." The wind rattled the window panes. "And the card?" Lady Langford asked. "Why a Christmas card?" "Because it was cruel," Miss Marple said simply, "and because it gave him one final illusion of control." Outside, the storm passed slowly over the hills, and with it, the shadow that had hung over the Langford estate began, ever so slightly, to lift. The storm outside had broken into a quiet drizzle, but inside the drawing-room of the Abernathy estate, the air crackled with tension. Everyone believed it was over. William Lennox, the solicitor with the red ink ledger and the hidden grudges, had confessed under pressure. He'd knelt at Miss Marple's feet like a crumbling statue, all dignity and deception finely stripped away. The case had been tied with a bow. The Christmas card signed by the murdered man had led to the truth, and the truth had led to justice, or so it seemed. Inspector Cray stood by the fireplace, arms folded. He offered a rare nod of approval. "Quite the work, Miss Marple. I must say, we were lucky to have you visiting when we did." "Luck," said Miss Marple softly, eyes fixed on the dying embers in the grate, "has very little to do with murder." She was quiet a moment too long. That pause, like a breath before the drop of a guillotine, pulled everyone's attention back toward her. Colonel Braithwaite shifted in his chair. Mrs. Carlyle, the housekeeper, wrung her hands together like damp laundry. Even the cat, Persephone, arched her back in the corner as though sensing a new storm. "I must confess," Miss Marple continued, turning to Cray, "something has been bothering me ever since Mr. Lennox confessed." Cray blinked. "You think he's lying?" "Oh, no. I believe he did kill Reginald Delaney, but I fear he did not do it alone, nor was it entirely for the reasons he gave." The hush in the room deepened. Even the old grandfather clock by the door seemed reluctant to tick. "You see," she went on, "there was one small detail I could not forget. That card, the one we found in the mail slot, the ink was fresh, too fresh, and the handwriting, while similar to Delaney's, had peculiar flourishes, distinctly feminine ones." Mrs. Carlyle went white. "It was meant to deceive us," said Miss Marple, "to suggest the card had been written before Mr. Delaney's death and only delayed in the post. But no postal markings, no envelope, just slipped into the slot." She looked directly at Mrs. Carlyle. "You posted it, didn't you?" The housekeeper's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. "You forged the handwriting. You knew Mr. Lennox would take the fall if nudged correctly. And he did. But you had a deeper reason." Cray stepped forward, suddenly alert. "Is this true, Mrs. Carlyle?" But the woman was already shaking, her composure unravelling. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," she whispered. "It wasn't supposed to end in blood." "Then why?" Cray demanded. "Why go to such lengths?" Miss Marple answered for her, gentle as a falling leaf. "Because of what happened nearly 30 years ago. The fire, the one that killed the original lady of the house, Mr. Delaney's first wife." There was a gasp. Even Cray looked blindsided. "Yes," Miss Marple said. "The incident no one spoke of. It was ruled accidental, a chimney fault. But I did some quiet inquiring. The local newspaper archive helped. The fire happened on Christmas Eve, another holiday tragedy, and Mrs. Carlyle, then Miss Edna Holloway, was the lady's personal maid." She turned back to the housekeeper. "You were in love with Mr. Delaney, weren't you?" The woman burst into tears. "He promised me," she sobbed. "He said he'd leave her, that we'd start anew. But then she fell pregnant and everything changed. I thought if she were gone—" "You lit the fire," Miss Marple said, not unkindly. "I didn't mean to kill her. I thought she'd get out." "But she didn't," said Cray. "No," Mrs. Carlyle whispered. "She didn't. And he never forgave me. He married again, cold, distant, but never me. He kept me in the house out of guilt. That's all it ever was. Guilt." "And so you helped kill him," Cray muttered. "No," she snapped. "I didn't. I only placed the card. I wanted Lennox to hang. He hated Reginald too. I knew he'd fall for the trap. But I didn't touch the man. I swear it." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Then who did?" That question, simple, clear, crashed down like a judge's gavel. For a breathless moment no one answered. Then a voice came from the doorway. "I did." It was Imogen Delaney. She had returned silently, unnoticed, rain-soaked from the garden, her hair clinging to her pale face. In her hands was a single rose, limp from the rain. "I killed him." The world seemed to hold its breath. Cray stammered, "Miss Delaney, you... what? Why?" She looked to Miss Marple as if asking permission to speak, and the old woman nodded. Imogen's voice was steady, quiet. "Because I found out the truth about my mother, the real story, not the one father told me. He always said she died in an accident, that she was weak, hysterical. But I found her journal last month, in the attic. She was scared. She wrote about the threats, the voices at night, how she feared her maid was poisoning her. And I found an old letter, one father never sent, begging forgiveness from someone named Edna." She looked at Mrs. Carlyle, whose face had gone grey. "I confronted him. He laughed, said she was mad, that I should be grateful he raised me at all, that I was nothing without him. So I waited until he was asleep. I used the same sleeping draught he gave my mother. I made sure he wouldn't wake." Cray stood frozen. "But why confess now?" "Because it's over," Imogen said. "I never wanted anyone else to die for what I did. Not Lennox. Not her." She dropped the rose on the carpet. This house has fed on lies long enough. And still, Miss Marple watched her with that curious look of knowing sadness. A brilliant trap, she said softly, but even the cleverest trap cannot hold truth forever. The silence returned, heavy and final. Cray moved to arrest her, and Mrs. Carlyle collapsed into her chair in sobs. Outside, the drizzle turned again to snow. Miss Marple turned back to the fire. There was no satisfaction in her eyes, only the quiet ache of understanding. Because in the end, the worst crimes are not always born of greed or rage, but of sorrow, shame, and secrets buried too long in the cold, damp earth. The courtroom was hushed, the late afternoon light filtering softly through the stained glass, casting fractured colours across the polished wooden benches. The villagers of Chipping Dean had gathered in muted anticipation, each face reflecting a mixture of relief, sorrow, and uneasy curiosity. The long, twisted saga of Edgar Blaine's murder, the slashed Christmas card, the stolen diary, and the tangled web of secrets had finally come to trial. Miss Marple sat near the front, her fingers lightly folded in her lap, her expression composed yet reflective. The trial had laid bare much, confessions, denials, and heartbreak. But now, as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict, an air of unresolved tension lingered like a fading shadow. The defendant, Evelyn Ford, once a demure secretary, and now revealed as the sister of the vanished Lisette, faced the court with a heavy heart. Her tears had flowed freely throughout the proceedings, and the evidence had painted a portrait of a woman driven by grief and a desperate need for justice. Yet, as the gavel struck and the verdict was read, guilty of manslaughter, a verdict tempered by mitigating circumstances, the true story behind the crime began to crystallize in Miss Marple's mind. Later, as the courtroom emptied and the village slowly dispersed into the chill evening air, Miss Marple found herself alone in the quiet of the old vicarage parlour. The walls, steeped in years of whispered confessions and quiet prayers, seemed to hold their breath as she reflected on the case. She retrieved her notebook where, between lines of careful observations, she had noted the subtle clues that had guided her through the labyrinth. There was the odd inconsistency in the Christmas card's envelope, a detail easily dismissed by others, yet crucial in revealing the card's true nature as a deliberate misdirection. The whispered confessions of the villagers, each coloured by their fears and desires, had woven a tapestry of half-truths and silences that only a patient eye could unravel. The disappearance of the diary had been a desperate attempt to suppress the truth, but ironically, it had only served to deepen the investigation, drawing out secrets long buried beneath the village's surface. The stolen evidence, the carefully forged documents, and the fractured alibis all pointed to a network of pain and betrayal, not just a single act of malice. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Evelyn, her pain, her courage, and the tragic weight of a family secret that had festered for years. Evelyn had not been merely a suspect. She was a living testament to the devastating consequences of hidden sins. The justice served was imperfect, a fragile balance between law and mercy. But even as the village sought to heal, a whisper of doubt lingered. Not all questions had been answered, not all wounds had been closed. The true extent of Victor Denham's misdeeds, the roles others had played in the shadowed corners of the estate, and the enduring scars left on the lives touched by the tragedy suggested that justice, while served, was only part of a larger truth. Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the village now dusted with the first snow of winter. The path to peace was long and winding, she knew, but it began with acknowledgement and understanding. Turning back to her notebook, she penned a final note. In the pursuit of truth, patience and attention reveal the smallest truths, the overlooked moments that others miss. It is in these details, the misplaced envelope, the hesitant witness, the silenced confession, that the real story lives. Justice is not merely about punishment, but about illuminating the shadows where secrets hide. As the last light faded, Miss Marple felt the familiar quiet satisfaction of a case closed, yet tempered by the knowledge that human nature's complexities rarely yield simple endings. Outside, the village settled beneath its snowy blanket, holding its breath once more for tomorrow and the mysteries it might bring. The village of Chipping Dean had settled into a quiet rhythm once more, its streets dusted with fresh snow, and its windows aglow with the soft light of hearth fires. The courtroom drama, the confessions, and the verdict had all passed into memory, leaving behind the fragile peace that follows a storm. Yet, for Miss Marple, peace was rarely as simple as it seemed. As she stepped onto the narrow lane leading away from the village, her coat pulled tightly against the biting winter air, her thoughts lingered on the case now closed. The familiar crunch of snow underfoot accompanied her measured pace, but beneath her calm exterior, a restless curiosity stirred. The truth had been revealed, justice administered, but a single, nagging detail refused to settle. It was the smallest thing, almost invisible among the myriad clues, the faint scent of lavender that had wafted through Victor Denham's study the night he died. No one else had noticed it, yet it was there, a whisper of fragrance that lingered in the wood-panelled room, as incongruous as a ghost's sigh. Lavender was not a scent associated with any of the principal players. Clara Denham preferred heavy musk, Evelyn Ford favoured crisp floral notes, and Henry Balfour was indifferent to such trivialities. But someone else, someone forgotten or overlooked, had been present, someone who knew the house intimately enough to move unseen. Miss Marple's mind returned to the maid's quarters, to Gertie, who had seemed nervous during questioning, her eyes darting when the topic of the vicarage arose. A slip of the tongue, a hurried glance, small things that might mean nothing, or might mean everything. She paused beneath the skeletal branches of an ancient oak, its limbs stretching like arthritic fingers against the grey sky. Her gaze settled on a scrap of paper partially buried in the snow, edges curled and softened by frost. Carefully she retrieved it, a torn fragment of a letter, written in a hurried hand. The words were cryptic. "Meet me where the shadows fall, before the dawn. The truth is closer than you think." No signature, no date, just an invitation to a secret meeting, abandoned and perhaps forgotten. A chill ran deeper than the winter air. Miss Marple folded the note carefully into her glove. The case was officially closed, but the echo of those words hinted at another story waiting in the wings, another secret lurking in the folds of this seemingly sleepy village. She smiled softly to herself, a smile that carried both reassurance and challenge. The world was full of mysteries, some solved, some not, and some that danced tantalizingly just beyond the reach of certainty. Adjusting her scarf, she turned toward the station, where Inspector Cray awaited, with the quiet patience of a man who knew the game was never truly over. "Still chasing shadows, Miss Marple?" he called with a wry grin. "Only the ones worth finding," she replied. And with that, they walked back together, the crunch of snow marking the steady rhythm of an investigation that, like the winter night, was far from over.